3 Mile Island, otherwise known as TMI. Too much information. No, the 3 Mile Island. TMI is, at this point was, and will be again, more on that later, a nuclear power plant located on the Susquehanna River in Londonderry Township, Dauphin County, near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was also the site of what is generally considered the worst nuclear accident in the history of the United States, rated a level 5 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, an accident with wider consequences. But much like Chernobyl, because the word nuclear is involved, there is so much misinformation about what happened at TMI, so many misunderstandings, so many conspiracy theories, and just ridiculous nonsense. And while a lot of people know there was an accident, I found that the vast majority of people don't actually know what or why it happened. Because frankly, even though it was a level 5 and was the worst accident involving a nuclear power plant in American history, it really wasn't that bad at all in the grand scheme of things. But there were numerous failings that led to the accident, mostly involving proper training for the personnel, as well as a design flaw with a single valve. But a true disaster was mitigated by a lot of automatic safety features that did work as intended. Thus, what happened at TMI is not classified as a full-tilt nuclear meltdown. It was a partial meltdown, and it was safely contained, thanks to the overall design elements of the reactor itself. The 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant started construction in 1968, and would wind up with 2 different nuclear reactors. TMI-1, or Unit 1, would go online on September 2nd, 1974, and Unit 2, her sister, went online December 30th, 1978. They were both built by Babcock and Wilcox, and both were PWR designs, or pressurized water reactors, but they were not identical twins. They were slightly different. Reactor 2 was larger than her older sister, but they worked in pretty much the same way. A PWR differs quite a lot from an RBMK reactor that the Soviets used and was involved in the Chernobyl disaster. A PWR, pressurized water reactor, is a light water nuclear reactor, a type of thermal neutron reactor that uses just regular old water, not heavy water, just regular water that you would drink, as both the coolant and the neutron moderator. They also use a solid form of fissile elements as the fuel. PWRs are actually quite common and constitute a significant majority of the nuclear power plants all over the world. And the reason is simply that they're exceedingly stable and generally pretty safe. The way these work is that the nuclear fuel in the reactor pressure vessel is engaged in a controlled fission chain reaction. That produces heat, which heats the water in the primary coolant loop. The primary coolant, which is water, is pumped into a heat exchanger, which is just a steam generator, which flows through several thousand different small tubes. The heat is transferred through the walls of those tubes to the lower pressure secondary coolant lines. The secondary coolant evaporates into pressurized steam, and as a result of this, the transfer of heat is accomplished without actually mixing the two fluids. Both sets of coolant water don't actually touch. And the reason for this is that prevents the secondary coolant from actually becoming radioactive. Remember, the primary coolant loop is going through the reactor, so that water is becoming irradiated. But because it's not touching the secondary coolant, that water stays pure and only receives heat to become steam. And the pressurized steam is fed through a steam turbine and produces electricity. It's a novel concept, and again, this type of design is extremely stable. Part of the reason is that they have a tendency to produce less power as the temperatures increase, which is good because part of the design requires the coolant to actually be quite hot all the time. That's why it's a pressurized water reactor. Because the water has to be at a much higher temperature, it actually exceeds the normal boiling point of water. But it has to stay as a liquid in order for this system to work, which is why it's pressurized. Water under pressure doesn't become steam quite as readily as standing water would. If you pressurize it, it'll stay in a liquid state even if the temperature exceeds the normal boiling point of water. Thus, the whole system is highly pressurized, with PSIs into the thousands. It can vary depending on what power output we're talking about, but much higher than, say, a steam locomotive, for example, that isn't a high-pressure design anyway. But that means the system has to be very well built in order to contain all that pressure. The piping has to be extremely strong, and therefore it can be a lot more expensive to build this design in the first place, and it is also very susceptible to corrosion. You don't want corrosion on any of these pipes at all because of the higher pressure. Corrosion naturally weakens metal, and if metal weakens, you can get a burst, and that can result in what's called a loss of coolant accident, or LOCA. This is a very specific mode of failure for a nuclear reactor, and it can lead to reactor core damage, and is in fact pretty much exactly what happened at TMI. It was a LOCA, but it didn't start out that way. In fact, the situation was a cascade of rampant stupidity and silly mistakes. The date was March 28th, 1979, though the actual situation started hours before. Reactor 2 was not very old. She'd only been commissioned in December the previous year. It was only a few months into operation, so she was effectively brand new. At the time, TMI 2, as she was known, was running at 97% power, almost full. The reason for this is that her sister, number 1, was off completely. She was shut down because they needed to refuel that one. So 2 was running pretty hot in order to pick up the slack. The beginning of the chain of events that would lead to the accident actually started on March 27th, though, 11 hours before the actual accident started. What happened was the operators were doing what was effectively routine maintenance. They were trying to unblock one of the 8 condensate polishers. These are devices used to filter water condensed from steam, and their job was to keep the secondary loop within the reactor clean. But these polishers were resin, and they had a tendency to let little bits get into the water and cause blockages. This was a normal problem that was run into all the time at the plant. The workers were pretty used to it, and generally what they did is use compressed air to force the blockage out. And in almost every case, that worked. But not this time. This particular bit of resin was very, very stuck, and the compressed air didn't make it budge. So they decided to incorporate water into the fix, and use the air to force the water forward and let the water, which was heavier, clear the resin. That did technically work. But in the process of doing this, they had unknowingly caused a very small amount of water to push through a stuck open check valve, and eventually come to rest into an instrument air line. It would lead to the accident beginning around 4 a.m. Because of the water, the feed water pumps, condensate booster pumps, and the regular condensate pumps shut down all at once, leading to what's called a turbine trip. That is an automatic safety shutdown of the steam turbine that happens if really anything that's weird is detected within the system overall. It's a safety device to avoid turbine damage or any kind of problems. If there's something wrong that the system detects, it will just shut the turbine off until the issue is resolved. That on its own probably wouldn't have been a big deal, but the pumps being shut off was. Remember, water in a PWR is both a neutron moderator and the coolant. Getting fresh feed water into the system is imperative for stable function. With the pumps off, that came to a standstill, and the steam generators weren't receiving any feed water at all. So heat transfer from the reactor coolant system, or RCS, dropped significantly, and the temperature began to rise. With the temperature rising, the water expanded, as it naturally does, causing it to surge into the system's pressurizer. That caused a pretty large steam bubble to form at the top of it, and as the expansion continued, the pressure in the system rose to dangerous levels, up to 2,255 psi. But, once again, there were safety devices in place just in case this sort of thing would happen. The system had what's known as a pilot-operated relief valve, or PORV. Once it reached the 2,255 psi, that valve was automatically opened. It was a safety valve, and it allowed the steam to escape through piping to the reactor coolant drain tank, which was located in the containment building basement. But because of the expansive heat, the water continued to expand, and the relief valve wasn't removing enough of the steam to drop the pressure very fast, or at all. The pressure continued to rise, but fortunately there was yet another safety device that activated automatically in this type of circumstance. The Reactor Protection System, or RPS, had a trip set point of 2,355 psi. If that was reached, and it was just 8 seconds after the turbine tripped, the reactor itself was also tripped. All the control rods were released and allowed to fall back into the core using the most reliable and abundant force available on our planet: gravity. They just fell back into the reactor. That's how it was designed. It was quite ingenious and simple. And the control rods worked. They did their job. They dropped into the core and halted the nuclear chain reaction, effectively shutting the reactor down. But remember when I talked about Chernobyl, that in a nuclear reactor, even when it's technically turned off, it is still generating heat, and that's due to nuclear decay. This is a normal part of the elements involved here. You can stop the fission reaction, but the decay is still going to occur. It's not a lot in the grand scheme of things. It was only 6% of the power level prior to the shutdown, but it was still enough to continue supplying heat to the coolant water. Because the turbine had tripped, steam was no longer being used by it, because it was off. And remember, there was no new feed water going to the steam generators. While the decay heat was relatively small compared to what they had been dealing with, there was really nothing cooling down the water, and there was still something providing heat to it. In these circumstances, heat remover had been restricted only to steaming the small amount of water remaining in the secondary side of the steam generators to the condenser using the turbine bypass valves. That was it. And to be clear, I should probably mention this, everything I've explained thus far, and will explain probably over the next 10 or 15 minutes, happened in just seconds. So if you're wondering what the operators are doing, well, they were mostly trying to figure out what was happening, because all of this just happened at once. When the feed water pumps were tripped and shut off, they did have 3 emergency feed water pumps turned on. That should have been putting fresh water back into the system, and one of the operators did note that the pumps were running. It was one of the things they checked. However, there was a small, minor issue that they did not notice. See, there were block valves on the lines that went to the emergency feed water pumps, and those were closed. They were not supposed to be closed. Ever, pretty much. In fact, there was a very, very clear rule within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, that dictated that in order for those block valves to be closed whatsoever, the reactor must also be shut down. It's never been definitively proven why they were closed, though it's suspected they may have been accidentally left closed during a surveillance test that happened just 2 days prior. Regardless, well, wasn't there some kind of indicator light showing that they were shut, that operators would have realized that this was a problem? Well, yes, there were 2 lights in the operator's room that showed whether or not those were closed. However, one was covered by a yellow maintenance tag. Thanks for that. And the other one, well, it's never been actually proven why he didn't notice the other one, because that wasn't blocked by anything. Except maybe, okay, this theory has never ever been proven definitively, and it sounds so stupid, but given how stupid the whole situation was, I could almost believe it. Some people suggest that he didn't see it because it was covered by his own large beer gut, because he was a bigger guy. Again, never been proven, but how would you like that? How would you like to know that you nearly caused a nuclear disaster because of your fat gut? Like, 600-pound life's got nothing on you, buddy. I am so sorry. But again, that's only a theory that may just be made up, and there's a lot of made up stuff about TMI. Either way though, the operator didn't notice that those valves were closed, meaning that even though the emergency feed water pumps were running, no new feed water was getting to the system. They couldn't get past the closed valves. After the reactor tripped, the secondary system steam valves were activated to reduce steam generator pressure and the temperature, thus cooling everything down. That was by design. It was supposed to do that. And the pressure continued to go down, dropping all the way to 2,205 psi. So things seemed to be getting back under control, and that amount of pressure was the reset point for the safety valve, the PORV, remember. When pressure dropped that far, the valve was supposed to be closed. Automatically, the electric power to the solenoid that opened the valve was cut, and therefore, by design, it was supposed to shut again. But the PORV was stuck open. And this was a major problem. This was the critical failure, right here. A single, stuck open valve. Because it was open, it continuously allowed coolant water to escape the system. And the problem was, the operators had no idea this was even going on because of another major design flaw with the PORV. Babcock and Wilcox were aware, through testing, that the valve could get stuck in the open position, and that was bad. So, in order to compensate for this, a light had been installed that turned on when it was open. So they had an indicator light. Did they not notice it? Oh no, they did, because it went off when the power was cut to the solenoid, and only when the power was cut. It didn't actually keep track of what position the valve was in, only whether or not electricity was going to the solenoid. Because of that, the light did go off even though the valve was still open. So the operators thought it was closed, when in reality it wasn't an accurate indication of the valve's position whatsoever. Because of this, over the next few hours, the operators were incredibly confused regarding the status of the system in general. They couldn't properly diagnose what was even happening because they thought the valve was shut. And they weren't necessarily inept, they just hadn't received proper training for a lot of the situations they were facing. They didn't know how ambiguous that light was. Their understanding is that it was very reliable and should be trusted. They didn't know how it worked exactly. And had they known, they might have been aware that it only told them that electricity wasn't going to power the valve, not that it was guaranteeing it was actually closed. It was very stupid. With the PORV in the open position, coolant kept being lost from the RCS. And as the operators kept track of the situation, the water level in the pressurizer was rising, but the RCS pressure was falling. Which was really friggin' weird. It didn't make any sense to them. They'd never seen anything like it. They'd never been trained for anything like it. Because the valve was stuck open, this was a loss of coolant accident, a LOCA. And the expected and trained for symptoms of a LOCA were drops in both pressure and the water level. Everything should be falling, because, the coolant's leaking out, so of course everything should go down, right? But the numbers were going in the opposite direction of each other, like it didn't add up. Like what is happening here? They didn't know, and they had never been trained, and there were no procedures in place for handling that kind of situation. And you're probably wondering, why was that happening? Well, the water level in the pressurizer was rising because the steam in the space at the top that had formed earlier was being vented through the stuck open valve. As a result, that was lowering the pressure, but allowing the water to rise. Because of the lowered pressure, the water from the coolant loop was permitted to surge in and create another steam bubble in the reactor pressure vessel head. The operators had no idea there was a steam bubble there at all. And once again, they hadn't been trained for it. And the information they were receiving was talking about high water levels and lowered pressure. And with the information they had to work with, they were more worried about the loop going solid, which is a term used to basically describe the system in a state where there's just no steam at all in the pressurizer. They had been trained very clearly to never let that happen, so they were trying to avoid that when that wasn't even the issue. But because they thought they had too much water, they decided to turn off the emergency core cooling pumps. Because the coolant was just allowed to spill out of this stuck valve, the relief tank that was being filled overfilled and spilled all over the place, causing an alarm to go off at 4:11 a.m. But it was ignored at first, even though all of this was a very clear indication of an ongoing Loka event. But they kind of had tunnel vision. They were so focused on the water level that they weren't really thinking logically about everything going on here. At 4:15 a.m., the relief diaphragm of the relief tank ruptured, and that allowed radioactive coolant to leak into the general containment building. The radioactive coolant would also be pumped from the containment building sump to an auxiliary building outside of the main containment area. And that didn't stop happening until 4:39 when the sump pumps were turned off. And please understand that the operators were completely confused and bewildered. They just didn't know what was happening, and it took them a while to figure it out. In the meantime, though, their reactor was not doing so hot. Well, I'm sorry, actually, scratch that. She was getting way too hot. At about 4:20 a.m., after 80 minutes with a growing steam bubble in the reactor pressure vessel head, the coolant water in the primary loop began to cavitate. Cavitation, when it comes to fluid mechanics, refers to a phenomenon in which the static pressure of a liquid reduces to below the liquid's vapor pressure, which leads to the formation of small vapor-filled cavities in the liquid. Basically, this water, which was supposed to stay water in the primary system, remember, became a mixture of steam bubbles and water, which passed through the 4 main reactor coolant pumps. The pumps were turned off, and the operators thought that the natural circulation would continue water movement through the core. However, because of the steam in the system, which again wasn't supposed to be there, the water couldn't circulate at all. It was brought to a standstill, and because it wasn't moving, it started converting to steam at a much faster rate, and that only got worse over time. The temperature continued to rise to an alarming level, and eventually, the top of the reactor core became exposed. A reaction occurred between the steam forming in the core and the zircaloy nuclear fuel rod cladding, a zirconium alloy. The reaction resulted in zirconium dioxide, hydrogen, and even more heat, which melted the nuclear fuel rod cladding and damaged the fuel pellets, releasing more radioactive isotopes into the coolant and produced hydrogen gas. It was great. It's wonderful. It was not good, and the control room had no idea that was happening whatsoever. They didn't realize their reactor was in the process of melting, and at 6 a.m., there was a shift change. Now, how would you like that? You just came in for your morning shift at the nuclear plant, and third shift tells you, yeah, we got problems. You haven't even finished your morning coffee, and all of a sudden there's a major crisis. You just showed up. But with fresh eyes on the scene, it was noticed that temperatures in the PORV tailpipe and the holding tanks were really, really high. As a result, they utilized a backup valve to shut off the coolant that was venting out of the PORV, finally stopping the Loka. But by that point, it had been allowed to just vent nuclear junk all over the place, in excess of 32,000 gallons! And at 6:45 a.m., the radiation alarms in the plant began to sound, because the contaminated water had reached the detectors. The radiation levels in the primary coolant water were 300 times the expected levels, and the general containment building for the reactor suffered serious contamination, with radiation levels in excess of 800 Roentgen per hour. At 6:56 a.m., one of the plant's supervisors declared a site area emergency, and less than a half hour after that, the station manager, Gary Miller, would announce a general emergency. 3 Mile Island was operated by a company called Metropolitan Edison, or Met-Ed, and when informed of the ongoing crisis, they immediately notified the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, or PEMA. Pima would turn right around and contact state and local agencies, including the governor of Pennsylvania at the time, Richard L. Thornburg, as well as the lieutenant governor, William Scranton III. Thornburg decided that he was going to pull Scranton from all his other duties and ask him specifically to focus on this exact crisis. He would be responsible for collecting and reporting on information about the incident to the press, to all relevant parties. It was Scranton's ballgame. Okay, great. But, Scranton's job was made significantly difficult. He received a lot of flack for his handling of the situation, but it really wasn't his fault in any way, because he was getting conflicting information. Like, a lot of conflicting information. He would hold a press conference in which he reassured everyone that there was no immediate danger, but then he also mentioned a small release of radiation and also no increase in normal radiation levels, which doesn't seem to make any sense. Those statements were also contradicted by another official, and statements from Med-Ed, who both claimed that no radioactivity had been released. So, the whole thing was a mess. Med-Ed wasn't being clear, and that caused significant friction between them and state officials, who started thinking that Med-Ed was trying to cover up the severity of the accident. Med-Ed had given assurances that everything is under control, and Lieutenant Governor Scranton passed that on Wednesday, March 28th. But later in the same day, he changed that statement, saying that everything was more complex than the company first led us to believe. Because of the conflicting statements surrounding the incident, people were worried. Schools were closed and residents were urged to stay indoors. Farmers were also asked to keep their animals under cover and on stored feed. Because of Met-Ed's inconsistency and everything going on surrounding the issue, the state authorities had gotten the Nuclear Regulatory Commission involved, the NRC, and based on the advice of their chairman, Joseph Hendry, it was decided to suggest the evacuation of pregnant women and preschool-aged children within a 5-mile radius of the plant. By March 30th, the evacuation zone was extended to a 20-mile radius. But a mandatory evacuation was never ordered, and, frankly, never needed. It was always a voluntary evacuation, and 140,000 people did leave the area to err on the side of caution, though most people chose to remain, and were never forcibly removed. The vast majority of the ones who had chosen to leave would return home within the following month. But as for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's part, well, they had been informed of the incident directly by Met-Ed, and had already activated their emergency response headquarters located in Bethesda, Maryland. From there, they dispatched their staff to the facility to investigate the issue directly. Both Joseph Hendry and the commissioner, Victor Galinsky, initially viewed the accident as cause for concern, but not alarm.
3.6. Not great, not terrible.
Galinsky was tasked with briefing reporters and members of Congress on the situation, and he also talked to the White House staff. But the NRC was running into severe roadblocks because, well, frankly, they weren't really prepared to deal with such emergencies. This was a learning experience for them because they realized they actually had a pretty bad command structure. Basically, they just didn't have one. No one really knew who was in charge, nor did they have the authority to order Met-Ed to do anything, or to force an evacuation. They could advise, but no one was technically under any legal obligation to listen to them, which was a significant issue. Granted, again, an evacuation wasn't necessary, but the point is, had it been necessary, the NRC would not have had the authority to make it happen. And back in the control room of the plant, they were still busily trying to figure out what was even wrong. They didn't know that the primary loop water levels were low, and that over half of the core was exposed. In order to get some more reliable data, a group of workers would take manual readings from the thermocouples, as well as getting a hold of a sample of the primary loop water. 7 hours into the emergency, they finally pumped new water into the primary loop, and the backup relief valve was opened to reduce the pressure so that they could fill the loop completely with water as it should be. After 16 hours, the primary loop pumps were also switched back on, and the core temperature began to drop. By that point, and they didn't know it until much later, the core had partially melted, but it had been halted. That said, they were still concerned about a lot of factors because they still didn't know exactly how damaged it was. They just said they didn't even know it had melted. And on March 29th, they decided they really needed to ensure the integrity of the reactor vessel, that it would keep whatever was going on inside of it. But in order to accomplish that, someone needed to get a boron concentration sample. With that data, they could check to see if there was enough of it in the primary system to shut down the reactor entirely. The problem with doing that is, in order to get that sample, they had to go into a rather radioactive area. This was a dangerous job, and Unit 2's chemistry supervisor, Edward Ed Hauser, volunteered to draw the sample when no one else stepped up. The ship's supervisor, Richard Dubiel, requested that Pete Valez, who was the radiation protection foreman for Unit 2, go with Hauser, and his job would be to monitor airborne radiation levels while Hauser focused on getting the sample. The intention was to make sure that neither of them would be overexposed during this job. They donned excessive amounts of protective clothing. They gave them everything they had, which turned out to be quite a lot. They had 3 pairs of gloves, 1 pair of rubber boots, and a respirator. And the pair headed into the reactor auxiliary building to get the sample they needed. Hauser managed to lose his pocket dosimeter while he was taking the measurements, but he was able to note that the sample he got looked like Alka-Seltzer, as he described it, and it was also very, very radioactive, with readings as high as 1,000 roentgens an hour. They only remained in that building for about 5 minutes and left as soon as they could. Unfortunately, neither one was overly irradiated, but Hauser would wind up going past the NRC quarterly dose limit for radiation exposure, which was just 3 rems back in 1979. He had received 4, and he was only allowed to come back to work the next quarter. On the 3rd day after the accident, the staff finally realized, oh, there's a hydrogen bubble inside of our reactor. What? That was a concern. Because a hydrogen explosion could... Well, it's an explosion. I don't think I have to explain why that would be a really bad thing. But through investigation, they realized that there was no risk of this. Because while hydrogen is exceedingly flammable and can be explosive, it needs oxygen in order to facilitate that. On its own, hydrogen won't burst into flame. It needs oxygen to actually burn. And the hydrogen bubble was underneath the dome, and there was no oxygen in there. So they relaxed a bit, but still decided to err on the side of caution and reduce the size of the hydrogen bubble. By just the next day, it was way smaller, and slowly, over the following week, they removed both steam and hydrogen from the reactor, using a catalytic recombiner and by simply venting it out. In terms of the radioactive contamination, well, that had happened when the cladding was damaged, while the PORV was still stuck open. As a result, fission products were released into the coolant and allowed to escape the system through the stuck-open valve. But fortunately, very few of the fission products that were actually released remained solid at room temperature. The result of this is that radiological contamination to the outside environment was relatively small. No significant level of radiation was attributed to the accident outside of the facility. Nothing really got out. There was a little bit, a very small amount, but most of the radioisotopes that were released were noble gases like xenon and krypton, and that resulted in an average dose of 1.4 millirems. Not even a full Roentgen. To the 2 million people near the plant. To be clear, that amount of radiation received by them is basically nothing. Some of you may have had chest x-rays before. The average dose from a chest x-ray is 3.2 millirems. So it wasn't even a chest x-ray. And on average, you, by existing, going outside, being hit by, like, say, the sun, receive roughly 310 millirems a year, annually. So basically what I'm saying is, yes, this was a nuclear accident, but outside of the plant it didn't really do anything. They still chose to be cautious though, and the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, started a process of sampling the environment at 3 stations closest to the plant. They would establish more monitoring stations by April 1st, which would later be expanded to 31 by the 3rd. They took continuous samples to make sure there was no significant increase in radiation, and found that no, not really. Maybe a little bit, but not enough to matter. Estimations showed it wasn't even enough to cause a single additional death from cancer among people in the area. It didn't even do that much. Other individuals also tested it. Researchers at nearby Dickinson College, who had access to radiation monitoring equipment that was sensitive enough to detect the fallout from Chinese atmospheric atomic weapons testing, pretty sensitive, also chose to collect soil samples, and also found there was no significant increase in radioactivity. In terms of the exact causes of the issue, well, the main commission established for the investigation was known as the President's Commission on the Accident at 3 Mile Island, generally referred to as the Kemeny Commission, named after the chairman, John G. Kemeny, who was president of Dartmouth College. This commission was created by U.S. President Jimmy Carter in April of 1979, and was carefully crafted to be a panel of 12 people who were chosen not just for their expert opinions, but also because it had a mix, an equal balance, of people with strong pro- and anti-nuclear views. The intention was that if you got both sides of the argument together to come to the truth of a situation, that would reduce the chance for possible bias in the final report. And it seems to have worked quite well. The Commission's findings are considered very reliable. They would agree that the release of radiation was so minimal outside of the plant that, again, it was inconsequential. This had not been a disaster worthy of, say, an exclusion zone. Nothing of that nature. But it was still something that didn't need to happen. And further investigations show that about half the core had melted, and the cladding around 90% of the fuel rods had completely failed. 5 feet of the core was gone. That's 18 tons of uranium that melted down and flowed to the bottom head of the pressure vessel, forming into corium, the spicy lava. But they did note that many of the safety features in the design of the reactor had worked, mainly that the reactor vessel itself, the second level of containment after the cladding, had maintained its integrity despite the meltdown, and contained the damaged fuel with nearly all the radioactive isotopes remaining safely inside, not escaping and potentially contaminating the surrounding area. They also discovered that there had actually been a small hydrogen explosion during the meltdown. It had jolted the reactor. That probably happened about 2 p.m., but that part has been a little bit disputed, as it seems to be less of an explosion and more of a simple hydrogen burn. And either way, it wasn't noticed. It didn't really do much of anything and only lasted between 12 and 15 seconds and didn't actually release any radioactive material. Again, the containment vessel stayed in one piece, so even if there was a small explosion, it didn't actually matter much. But anti-nuclear political groups disputed the Kemeny Commission's findings, because one of the big problems that surrounded TMI, and still does to this day, that causes the whole thing to be rife with misinformation, has mostly to do with hippies! It's always the hippies! Would you people shut up and get educated? Sorry. I get frustrated with these morons who say things without knowing anything. One of these individuals was Arnie Gunderson, who you'd think would know better because he was a former nuclear industry executive, but he was a strong anti-nuclear advocate, and he would make multiple comments about TMI that are frankly insane. He said, "I think the numbers on the NRC's website are off by a factor of 100 to 1,000. Really? Really? If they were off by that much, people would be vomiting and suffering radiation burns. Nothing like that happened. And he's the one that pushed the idea of a hydrogen explosion that caused a high dose of radiation to occur. He went beyond this and claimed that the blast was actually very strong, and that the control room shook and doors were blown off their hinges, which absolutely zero eyewitnesses corroborate whatsoever. This man is a fool. Ridiculous. Instead, the investigation and blame was laid squarely on multiple systemic failings, a lack of training for personnel, and Babcock and Wilcox. Oh yeah, B&W was not innocent here because they knew about the flaw in their valve. Had that valve shut as it was supposed to, basically nothing that happened afterwards would have happened, because all the safety systems worked well. It was just the valve didn't close, and the Company Commission noted that that valve, the PORV, had previously failed 11 separate times. 9 of those times were in the open position and allowed coolant to escape. A similar incident happened just 18 months before at the Davis-Besse nuclear power station over in Oak Harbor, Ohio. The difference there is that the operators of that plant identified the failure of the valve after just 20 minutes. Thus, they were able to remedy it pretty quick, and they were also only operating the reactor at just 9% power at the time, whereas TMI was almost full power. B&W was criticized for the flaw and not properly notifying their customers regarding the issue, or actually, fixing it. MedEd was criticized for their inadequate information and response, as well as their management setup, because again, a lot of the staff hadn't been trained properly. The commission pointed out that many of the actions taken by the operators were inappropriate under the circumstances, but didn't necessarily blame them directly, because they were operating under procedures that they were required to follow. They were reacting based on what they'd been trained to deal with, and thus, none of them had the tools available to them to actually handle a situation like this. As a result, none of them were held for criminal negligence or anything of that nature because they had done nothing wrong. They did their best in the situation they found themselves in. But all in all, what was proven at TMI at the very least, and this should be praised, was that the safety systems, the automatic ones, for the most part, outside of that stupid safety valve, worked. Can you imagine how bad this would have been if a significant majority of those fail-safes just hadn't been there or hadn't functioned? I mean, how many times during that story did I say, this thing happened automatically? It was designed to be as safe as possible. Obviously it was flawed, and this was an accident, but because of all the safety systems in place, it didn't result in a complete and utter disaster. The contamination was restricted to inside that plant, and basically nowhere else. But that didn't stop anti-nuclear activists from going crazy and holding protests and demonstrations demanding that we stop using nuclear power. It's dangerous for us. Quick, make more coal plants. Those are notoriously clean. Frickin' hippies, man. One demonstration happened in New York City and involved 200,000 people in September of 1979, with speeches given by Jane Fonda and Ralph Nader. Oh boy, I can't wait to hear from those two. How you doing, Hanoi Jane? You gonna tell us more about how the North Vietnamese definitely weren't horrifically torturing our armed forces? Go on. Tell us. Tell us, Jane! It was obnoxious, though several lawsuits were filed, and one in favor of the citizens affected by the TMI accident. This was due to the fact that it still put them at risk, so they won a $25 million out-of-court settlement in 1981. Part of that money was used to found the TMI Public Health Fund. Additionally, in 1983, a federal grand jury indicted MedEd on criminal charges for falsification of a safety test result. That happened prior to the accident. MedEd would eventually come to a plea bargain agreement and pled guilty to a single count of falsifying records and no contest to 6 other charges. 4 of those were dropped. They had to pay a $45,000 fine and set up a $1 million account to help with emergency planning in the area surrounding TMI. The TMI plant operator and its insurers also paid out millions of dollars in publicly documented compensation to residents for things like loss of business revenue, evacuation expenses, and other such things, because, well, a lot of people did choose to evacuate, and a lot of people weren't coming into the area to, say, buy things because radiation that they didn't know whether or not it was there. I mean, there were still some things that did affect the lives of people. No one died as a result of this, thank God, but it was still a problem. So they had to pay out some money regarding that, but there was one class action lawsuit that did fail because they accused of the accident causing detrimental health effects. This was rejected, with the final appeal of that decision failing in 2002, mostly because there weren't any detrimental health effects. Thank goodness. There wasn't that much radiation released, a negligible amount. This was not Chernobyl, but its effects lingered. As the most famous American nuclear accident, it did increase support for anti-nuclear activists, and slowly but surely, we stopped building a lot of new nuclear reactors. The industry came to a standstill. Those that were still running were allowed to keep running, but the industry had seen explosive growth up until that point, and that suddenly slowed down. The real nail in the coffin for a while was Chernobyl, though, because that had been a genuine, complete, and total disaster that legitimately got people killed. That didn't happen in TMI's case, but the point is, it scares people. Radiation is a scary concept. Ionizing radiation is a very scary concept, because it's invisible, it's tasteless, you can't see it. But it will kill you. And people have an understandable fear of the unknown. You know, like, say someone comes at you and points a gun in your face. That's pretty scary, you know? But at least you can see the person holding the gun in that circumstance. Radiation doesn't work this way. So people are naturally scared of it, even though, in the case of TMI, a lot of the safety systems worked well and mitigated things, stopping it short of becoming a complete and total disaster. People still live right next to the plant, and can. And also, while it was decided that reactor number 2 was damaged beyond repair, reactor number 1 would be later reactivated. After the accident, the license to operate TMI-1 was suspended by the NRC, pending investigations into the management of the plant overall. By 1982, citizens of the 3 counties surrounding the site all voted overwhelmingly in a non-binding resolution to retire the remaining unit permanently. But in 1985, a 4-1 vote by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission allowed them to resume operations because, frankly, they decided that the citizens were only saying, no, don't turn it back on, because they were scared of something they didn't understand. And their votes didn't actually matter in this case, because it wasn't a binding resolution. It was basically a petition in that case. But the NRC decided that there was nothing wrong with turning Reactor 1 back on. And truth be told, there wasn't. Nothing really major at all ever happened with Reactor 1. She would plug along just fine for many years as the cleanup of Reactor 2 continued. Things aren't still completely cleaned up with Reactor 2, as it was decided to take things exceedingly slowly since it was safely contained. It was decided that, generally speaking, they would let a lot of the isotopes simply decay, and on May 8th, 2023, it was announced that 99% of the nuclear fuel had been cleaned up and that the site had entered the next phase of the process, and that was planned to last until 2029. That section of the plant is expected to be demolished by 2052. But, as for reactor number 1, well, as I said, she was allowed to keep operating, but was eventually shut down in 2019 due to it being uneconomic to keep her in operation. The plant was effectively mothballed, and she was slated for decommissioning, but she is going to be turned back on! Heck yeah, baby! Unit number 1 is coming back from the dead, and it was announced in September of 2024 that Constellation Energy will be using her to not only provide jobs for the immediate area, but to sell the electricity directly to Microsoft, because they want to use all that energy to power their new data centers to support artificial intelligence. Yes, that's right, people. TMI Reactor number 1 is going to help power AI technology. We are going to have AI that is nuclear powered! Oh man, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, I don't really mind it because, again, there's really nothing wrong with Reactor 1. Unit 1 is expected to come online by 2028, following approval by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But Unit 2, the problem sister, is never going to be turned back on, as I said. Cleanup is still ongoing, but the remains of her side of the plant still are there, and can be easily viewed from the shore of the Susquehanna. A solid reminder of how careful we do have to be with nuclear power, but also, I would say, a reminder of how well we can prepare for a disaster. Again, A lot of the safety features worked, and despite it being a partial meltdown, we can still live right next to the plant without a problem. That said, I still think we should be careful. You know? Definitely don't want to do what the Soviets did. Haha! Take that, by the way, Soviet Union, you filthy communists! Our worst nuclear accident is nothing compared to what y'all did. We don't know what an exclusion zone is and why. We didn't need one. Take that!
To capitalism!
Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.